as Tim said, my name is Brian Phillips. I'm actually born and raised just north of Utah State University in Preston, Idaho, Riverdale, Idaho, technically, if you know anything about that, or know a lot about that area. And I have two brothers with Down syndrome. And so I had known from as early as I can remember that I wanted to be in disability services. I just had no language or real knowledge of occupation to know where. And so I wandered through my undergraduate degree in psychology, and then I signed up for school counseling. I just kind of settled on this idea that I knew there'd be people with disabilities in the schools. And a week before I was supposed to start that program, I passed a poster at Utah State University, actually, where I was an alum. And the poster was about rehab counseling, and off I went. I switched my graduate degrees, and I haven't looked back. I did my PhD work at Michigan State University after about 5 years of practicing rehab counseling. And then following my PhD, I was at UW-Madison in Wisconsin for 8 years as a professor there, and just came back a year and a half ago, largely because I want to be closer to my two brothers and my family and these great colleagues. But honestly, the option to be close to the CPD was in my mind as well. It's such an incredible resource to the community. There's not many places quite like it. So it's a thrill for me to be connected with them today a little bit too. So that's a little bit about myself. And what I'm excited to talk about today is ethics. And I'm truly excited because the way I talk about ethics, or the way that ethics has started to be a reflection for me, is something that I do deeply care about and find interesting. So I'll share my screen and walk you through a little bit about this story. All right, let me make this nice and big. And want to still be able to see some of you, as many of you as I can. So ethics is an interesting conversation. I'm a CRC, and so I'm actually at the end of my 5 years, and so I'm taking lots of ethics classes myself right now. I've signed up for all those CEUs I need to be able to maintain my CRCC, and I'm CRC, and I'm sure many of you find yourselves in similar boats every few years. Traditional ethical training is not something that I've always enjoyed. And I'll even go as far as to admit, even some of the recent ethics trainings I've gotten to maintain my CEUs haven't quite gotten to the place where they've caused a lot of reflection or change for me. In traditional ethics training, there's this assumption that knowledge or information is the solution to addressing any gaps in our ethics or in our behaviors. So if we can just learn the code of ethics that we ascribe to a little bit more or better, then we're going to be more ethical. If we can spend a lot of time in the gray areas of the challenging moments that we may or may not experience very frequently, then we'll be more ethical. And so it's framed under this idea of right versus wrong. And if we learn enough about the right, we won't do what's wrong. Another assumption built in is that it's about making a rational decision about what to do. So traditional ethical training, again, has this idea that when we are confronted with an ethical dilemma, we get through it using our mind to decide what's the best course of action. And it's a planful decision. It's a strategic and thoughtful decision that we make. Today, I'm going to challenge both of these 2 points in my explanation of behavioral ethics. The last part, and I think this is the part that I was guilty of in some of my earlier education, is that ethics was really about good people versus bad people, with, of course, good people making good decisions and bad people making all those bad decisions. And so sometimes I'd walk into an ethics training, and just like almost everybody else in the world, I'd say, well, I think I'm in the good people category. So there's probably not a lot for me to worry about here. And I don't think that there's a lot for me to learn. Again, what we know from the research is that none of these 3 assumptions are supported at any level. And it's actually quite helpful for me to admit that I could be in a good category, good people box, and still make some pretty awful decisions. All right, so here we go to question some of these things. Are we always rational? What we know from the research is the answer is painfully no. And if you needed one more slide to think about it, the answer is painfully no. We are not always rational in our decisions. Oftentimes we're persuaded by things that we couldn't even describe if we were asked to. Why did you do something? Oftentimes I ask my kids this when they do something that I just seems absolutely without ration or thought. And the answer is, I don't know. But then I turn to myself and realize I'm in the same boat sometimes. I find myself unable to explain why behind my behavior or even my values sometimes. All right. And also, we have to question if we even always want to be ethical. Honestly, this is one of the biggest missing pieces in a lot of our ethics training. You could memorize your code of ethics, but if you would rather not do it, if you're compelled to act in a different way, then it's not going to do a whole lot for you. If we take this away from ethics, this is a no-brainer for us. We've all said, and even envisioned ourselves going on a morning run. We've said, oh man, that's going to be fantastic. I'm going to wake up at 5, right as the sun's about to rise, if we're later in the year. I'm going to have this great run in the morning. And then our alarm clock goes off at 5. And this only thought that goes through our minds is, what in the world was I thinking? This feels like a terrible idea to get out of bed. I'm not moving. You shut off the alarm clock and you don't even get close to thinking about running. Now, that's not ethics. Going for a run is not a moral decision. But we have something similar that often happens to us when we're confronted with ethical decisions. The frank, honest truth is sometimes we just don't want to do what's ethical. And that's something we need to confront more often than we do. Sadly, when we sit in classes and we talk ethics, it feels just like that night when I'm thinking about running in the morning. Nothing's going to stop me from running, I say, only to find that when I'm confronted with something more like the real world, I could be persuaded otherwise. All right, so let me just talk to you about my journey for a moment in a little bit of a funny story. So I'm teaching an ethics class in Wisconsin, and I feel like I'm nailing it because that's what professors think sometimes. And I'm talking to students about how to be ethical people. Near the end of the semester, after all of this training's been given on being ethical, this is the text that flies back and forth between 2 of my students in the class. One student taking a multicultural aspects class was supposed to attend several events that would help them have more exposure to cultures other than their own. This is the text that flies from one of the students. Guess who got a hundo without attending any events? Exclamation point. And this was a little disheartening to this ethics teacher because the issue was actually shared by the student that this was sent to, saying, I'm not comfortable with this. I think this, my peer, should have been taking this more seriously, this multicultural competency. They turned in the student, and I got to have a conversation with this student, all while she was taking an ethics class. That's not really an ideal measure of course evaluation for me, when, as I teach an ethics class, a student gives a text saying, guess who got a hundo without attending any events? Now, sadly, we know from the data that about 65% of graduate students cheat at some point during their programs. It's a lot higher if you're a business student than if you're a rehab counseling student. We know that from the data, but it's still awfully high across all degrees. Okay, so the other point that I wanted to talk about, traditional ethics often looks at and zooms in on the, shall I say, sexiest of ethical dilemmas. So the grayest of the gray situation, where even if you brought in a full team of just ethical experts, they would be scratching their heads on what to do. These are choices where you've got 2 principled rights and you're trying to weigh which, or 2 or more principled rights, you're trying to weigh which one might be the better right, or even more consternating, you've got 2 or more wrongs and you're trying to say which one's the least wrong or which one would be my most ethical choice out of these options. And the textbooks dwell on these constantly. The funny thing is, as I think back to my 5 years as a rehab counselor, practicing rehabilitation counselor, rarely did I see an ethical dilemma rise to this level of confusing gray, where I involved a panel of individuals to help me sort it out. Even more so than that, I want to pose this next question. Why do people end up in the paper for a lack of ethics? A really interesting study was done by a group led by a person with last name Offstein in 2017. And they looked at the answer through the Wall Street Journal. They just took 30 days of Wall Street Journal and they looked for any scandal, any kind of moral failing. And they said, what caused it? And over this 30-day period, they found 47 business scandals in the first 5 pages of the Wall Street Journal. So a little bit more than one a day. And they asked the question as they looked into these scandals, what caused the person to make a poor ethical decision? One of the main things they were looking for was it hard to know what to do? Or was it actually, quite frankly, a no-brainer what to do and they just chose the wrong path? In all 47 cases of this simple sample, not a single case actually presented with that sexy version of an ethical dilemma where you had these really hard competing rights or these really hard competing wrongs. What was happening over and over in every of the 47 cases was people obviously knowing what was right and choosing something else anyway. I would ask if this is actually that different from us with the next slide. Why do counselors make the licensing board website for ethical violations? We have some answers to this question. You can see now this is a little bit small, so forgive me. I'll just note some points here, even if you may not be able to see it perfectly well. Here are, according to an article from Wilkerson in 2017, again, the leading causes of state licensing board violations. Now, in some of these areas, you could argue there may have been a gray area. They did not conduct this study to look at whether it was gray area or not. But I hope you can appreciate looking at this list, just in a very simple way, that many of these things are not in the gray. Having sexual relations with clients, which always is in the top 3 of ethical violations for counselors, is not confusing. It's not a hard decision to make. It certainly doesn't require an ethical panel, and yet here we are. Failing to acquire continuing education credits, you may view as gray, but most cases were actual people lying on purpose that they had more credits than they did when they were trying to get relicensed. So again, you may argue that you could accidentally, maybe not in the gray, but just as a point of forgetfulness, not get your credits. But saying you had more credits than you know you have is different, and it's not confusing, and it's not gray. The list goes on, showing us that many of the things that are violations are not confusing. They are not questionable. They're just wrong. So we don't really necessarily need to spend our whole 15 weeks when we're teaching classes, or my whole hour with you, talking about the gray areas of ethics. What I need much more in my personal life is just to do what I know I should do more consistently than I currently am. And that's what we'll talk about in the context of today's behavioral ethics training. It seems obviously that information is not always the magic elixir to unethical behavior. In fact, one funny side note, early research is showing that people who take a traditionally based ethics class actually perform worse ethically in real world behavior after taking the class than prior to the class. That's not good. Another funny thing across about 5 studies, and I don't have time to get into details, ethics professors or ethicists for a living are not more ethical in their day-to-day life than non-ethicists, we found. And so again, information is not the silver bullet for where we need to go to improve our behavior and practice. So then, what should the goals of an ethics training be after all of this disparaging information? Let me be clear. It should always involve something of a knowledge of the code and how to be ethical. Honestly, I just took an ethics training the other day telling me about how I should be using social media. For instance, whether I should look up a client, the answer is no, on social media. These are new questions that I've not thought about. I could be in a gray area here, and it's good just to know what's right. So I'm not saying let's get rid of information. Never will you hear professors say that. But we must add to information is what I came to realize as I went through my journey of trying to teach in ethics, and more importantly, trying to live my own ethics. So my answer to the goal, and we'll spend the next rest of our time talking about these points. My goal as an ethics teacher is to develop moral humility, moral awareness, a little bit increased moral motivation, and helping people I teach think about the structure of their environment and how it facilitates moral choice for good or for bad. So I spend little time on the code because I know they can look it up. And honestly, I have none of the code memorized. I always have to look it up whenever I'm in one of those compelling. But much more important to me is my students walk away feeling less confident that they'll always do what's right, less sure that they're, without having to plan or strategize, going to recognize when they're in an ethical dilemma at all, and more sure that they need to be diligent if they're going to be their best selves. Comments or questions at this point? I try not to drone on, but alas, I sometimes do. And Tim, will you help me with the chat? It's really hard for me to see it with my current screen.
Yeah, I'll help you out. No questions are coming through.
All right. Don't be shy. Feel free to chime in here whenever you'd like. All right. So this may be a little bold, but if you walk away from today's training feeling drastically more confident in your ability to be ethical based on what you know, then I failed. Because my goal is actually the opposite today. I would prefer that you walk away today saying, you know what? I don't have to give up the view that I'm a good person, but I do have to separate that from the possibility that I could do bad things more frequently in my day-to-day life. Sadly, what we know from the research, and it's discouraging, most people have an extreme Lake Wobegon effect when they think about their own ethics. In fact, on average, people say that they're at least as ethical as Mother Teresa when asked, which is a little bit bold. But the vast majority of us sit in somewhere between 70 and 92% saying that we're more ethical than our peers or than our mentors. That's dangerous because it's not true, for one. It's an statistically impossible event, but it also means many of us are probably walking around not just confident, but arrogant about the good behavior in our day-to-day lives. That can be dangerous. Now, let me just offer one more caution. How dangerous can that be? I would argue in our profession, where we're working with people who are marginalized and sometimes have some limits to their cognitive capacity, for us to walk around ethically arrogant could be a perfect storm of harm and bad behavior. Now, we won't make the Wall Street Journal because no one makes the Wall Street Journal when they're making $60,000 a year or less. But we will make a very harmful impact if we go around our work arrogantly, thinking that we will only act in the best interest of those we're serving. All right, so this is where behavioral ethics enters. And this is the more recent introduction of ethics that's totally changed how I teach behavioral ethics in the classroom. And so that's why when Tim came to me saying, do you have anything to talk about with ethics? I said, you bet I do, because it took me a few years of teaching it the wrong way to really appreciate that there's something more we could do to influence behavior in a realistic way. Behavioral ethics, finally defined here, I've mentioned it so many times, really just considers the how and the why of ethical and unethical behavior. To me, it's the science of helping good people be good, because behavioral ethics probably isn't going to help people who view themselves in the bad category or who just want to do bad things more than anything else. It's not going to help people any more than a code of ethics, perhaps a little more, but not much. All right, here's a great quote, and you can find this in almost every newspaper story or scandal in some way, shape, or form. But I loved how this one was shared from the Harvard Business Review. A former federal prosecutor named Serena Vash said, "When I first began prosecuting corruption, I expected to walk into rooms and find the vilest people. I was shocked to find ordinarily good people I could well have had coffee with that morning. And they were still good people who'd made terrible choices." Again, that's ethical humility, to appreciate that that's usually the facts. Thankfully, as rehab counselors or in other related roles, you know this firsthand. I still have vivid memories in working in downtown Salt Lake with people who had committed some vile crimes and seeing good people across the table from me. That changed a lot of how I viewed the world, but it didn't just make me think that all people were good. It also helped me to think I could do bad. And my good people card didn't keep me or prevent me from such a possibility. So what leads to poor ethical decisions? Of course, sometimes we'll hold up the Ted Bundys or the Bernie Madoffs, and we'll study these terrible things they might have done. And we might come to some false conclusions that people who do bad things just are bad. But I like to tell this version instead. This is my view of bad ethical decision making. What I try to describe in this picture is that for me, my rational self is this dude on the elephant. For me, my irrational behavior is the elephant. The indication of this, as I like to visualize it, is I'm actually a really good boy when my rational self aligns with my irrational self or my emotional self. So I can guide that elephant on a Friday night when I'm telling myself I'm going to go running. It's easy. I'm feeling fully in charge, and the elephant in me isn't even resisting. It just says, yeah, what a great idea, no problem. At 5 a.m., the elephant's fully awake to say, there's no way I want to get out of this bed. And my rational self can pull and compel and try to steer that elephant, but I don't tend to win when I haven't made a plan. And so most unethical behavior, I would argue, is a failure to account for the elephant. Let me be clear here in saying, I don't think it's impossible to win the elephant. There's things we can do to put blinders on the elephant, to make a path so that we don't pass by something that is compelling to the elephant, to take it off course of where we want to go. There are strategies we'll talk about today to make sure that we can, as our smaller rational self, guide the elephant in us to good behavior. But it's very dangerous when we assume that the rational self is a much more powerful and large part of our decision making than that emotional, irrational part of us in our decision making. That's where we get in trouble. Comments or questions to this point? I can't see all of you. In a physical room, I kind of can feel whether you have questions or concerns here. I'm just at a loss. Let me give a moment if there's anybody who needs a question or a chat. Okay, then we sally forth. So some leading influences on poor ethical decision making that I want to focus on today. And I'm going to spend more time talking about what throws us off than what actually allows us or compels us to be good. That's partially just because we have an hour, but it's even more because we often fail to acknowledge what throws us off course even more than what could help us get back on course. So again, my goal to have you be less confident is connected to me helping you see that there's so many ways and influences in our lives that cause us to get off course. So 3 things I want to talk about that influence our decision making in the negative: our desires, biases, and mental shortcuts. I'm going to particularly focus on thinking fallacies and just plain wanting something else. Situational factors. It's shocking in our ethical discussions how little we think about situations. These are the urges, habits, or addictions that someone might experience. It's being tired, perceived anonymity that we might have, or cover. Do you know, just as a fun little side note, people who are asked in a research study to do something where they could choose to do the wrong thing, do the wrong thing much more often when they're given this research in a dark room than in a lit room. So just being in a dark room means that the probability of someone cheating, for example, goes up substantially, significantly in controlled studies. And this has been replicated over and over again. These are situations that we rarely account for. And then finally, mood and emotions are the last part I'll talk about in situational factors. And then the last one, very important, external pressures. We'll talk about both the informal social pressures we might experience and the organizational pressures that can come in and have a major sway in our lives. All right, so some common thinking fallacies. The first one, I've already referred to it to some extent, is the forecasting error. We often think about what we're going to do when there's no elephant putting other pressures on us. So this is the example of going for a run. It's the example that I'm going to work really hard tomorrow, even though I know social media is going to be really compelling when I get tired. It's all of these factors that we may not consider. So we just have a tendency as human beings to have major errors in forecasting. We think we'll be good, and we don't tend to challenge why we might not be good. And therefore, we don't plan for any of the barriers that will come into place. This causes unethical behavior. When I say I'm going to act ethically, but I don't even think about what might cause me not to, I'm much less likely to be prepared for those challenges or that resistance I'll feel in the moment. Again, simple alarm clock example, and then we'll get into counseling examples when we get more applied here. If I don't realize that I'm not going to feel like I'm in the mood to run at 5 a.m., my chances go down drastically. What could I do? I could get my running shoes out and put them outside my bedroom. That way I don't wake up my partner when I get up to run. Because one of the great excuses the elephant uses for me at 5 a.m. when I want to run is, oh, if I get up and start shuffling around the closet for all my workout clothes, I'm going to wake up my partner, and then she's going to be ticked. I may as well stay in bed. If I plan ahead for these kind of elephant conversations, the rational side starts to get a little bit more control. I might, as many of you might do this, put the alarm clock a little further away when I know I've gone to bed too late for a 5 a.m. and I'm going to need a little bit more encouragement to actually get myself out of bed. Then you put the alarm clock on the other side of the room, which is the antithesis of being kind to my partner, but it makes sure I get up. These are the kind of things we might do to control the elephant when we're forecasting. Ethical fading. Ethical fading is fascinating, and we're going to talk about this in its own slide a little bit more. But it's the notion that when we get to that point or that space where we're not in the mood to make the right decision anymore, we start to change the decision from a moral decision, which would mean I'm doing something good or bad, to something less severe. This has been framed in the research oftentimes as I'm making a management decision. One of the great examples of this is the Challenger rocket. This is the example that's thrown around every time behavioral ethics talk about ethical fading. You may or may not know the Challenger rocket, which was prepared largely from right here in Utah's Thiokol. The engineers on the morning of launch knew that it was too cold of conditions for a safe launch. And they proceeded to tell management that that was the case. If the engineers had been allowed to continue their consideration and conversation, they would have appreciated that this was a safety issue, which made it a moral issue. What we have rich documentation on is that the management of Thiokol actually invited all the engineers to leave the room, except for one who they said, you can stay as long as you realize this is a managerial decision, not an engineering or a safety decision. When they put on the ethical fading to say, we're not talking about whether this will kill lives or not, we're arguing how much this will cost to delay this flight another month, it became very clear that Challenger should be launched. And it was, and 7 people lost their lives. What was the issue? In large part, they took ethics out of the equation to make it easier to make a management decision. That's a prime example of ethical fading. We often will reframe what we're doing to make sure that the moral part gets reduced and maybe the more pragmatic part gets focus for us. All right, moral dissonance. We tend to take a moral dissonance and fix it. One of the ways we fix this is we say, I meant to act ethically, therefore I did. And we'll share some examples about how we can do this very easily in a moment. Then finally, we have our biases. Confirmation bias. We know that we tend to look for evidence that supports what we want to do. The Iraq War offered a perfect example of this. Whether or not there were, these weapons of mass destruction that were claimed was largely blocked by confirmation bias. What we found in the records after analyzing this in research is that people who were reviewing this were looking for what they wanted to see. And when you're looking for something, you tend to find it. And it also led to the ignoring of the information that was contrary. Going back, they found that the evidence actually stacked up to show that there wasn't weapons of mass destruction, but a confirmation bias among those who were asked to filter this information led to a conclusion that almost all of the evidence suggested there was weapons of mass destruction and almost no evidence in the contrary, even though the reality was quite the opposite. Overconfidence bias, we've already talked about, in that arrogance. And then self-serving bias. Sadly, we know from the research that what we tend to want is what we tend to think is ethical. So if something's going to serve me or gratify me, I'm much more likely to say that it's fair or good. A recent example of this that made me laugh in the paper is there was a person who had been a prominent advocate for a $15 minimum wage. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not here to get on a political soapbox for you. But the funny thing is they're being interviewed by the news and they just opened up their own business. And they said, you know what? I've always been an advocate for a $15 wage or a livable wage. Now I'm not so sure. Now I'm not so sure that's the fair thing to do. Now, again, have your own opinion about what the fair thing to do is in that complicated conversation. The fact of the matter here is when it became self-serving to not have a $15 wage, it became a lot harder to see that as the fair choice. And that's the case for all of us. We often align what's good for us as good for everyone. And sometimes there's a gap there. So how does this work when you put it all together? Well, you have your forecasting error that says, I should behave ethically, therefore I will. End of story. That's kind of how we end a lot of our academic coursework in ethics. Oh, that's what the Code of Ethics has to do? Okay, that's what I'll do. And then we get to the point of decision. And the elephants don't bark. The elephant's making a lot of noise in whatever way elephants make noise, and it's saying, I don't really want to do this anymore. And we feel this visceral response that can often lead to an ethical fading. And it says, I don't see the ethical implications of this decision, so I do what I want to do. And perhaps even most dangerous in this whole model, we actually know from the research that we're incredible at this last step, which is rewriting the story, getting rid of that cognitive or ethical dissonance, moral dissonance. I should have behaved ethically, therefore I did. And we can create that very easily just by focusing on some facts and not others. We can create that by justifying ourselves. Many times I've seen in the Wall Street Journal, it's a case of they had lots of money, they weren't going to miss it. This is a rewriting of the story to say, I was ethical, I was taking care of my family. I mean, you want me to support my family, don't you? Certainly I could picture for those people who lied about how many CEUs they had to keep their counseling license, there was probably some mindset at some point in time saying, well, listen, this is about me being able to take care of my family. Shouldn't I be able to do that? And isn't that a good that merits me just saying I got a few more CEUs than I actually got? This is the way simply we can rewrite stories to say I am still good and I still make good decisions. And that's not a bad thing. I don't want anyone to walk away from this presentation saying I'm bad. But what I am sad about is that it promotes the continued arrogance to say, I will never do anything but good. And I don't even have to really think about it. I just have to rewrite the story each time I act. All right. Any comments or questions? Even if you just want to say, I'm still with you, Brian. so little immediate feedback in these kind of sessions.
I'm with you, Brian.
Hey, you are my friend. Thank you.
My colleague next door says, hey, he's my instructor. He really liked you.
Well, good. I paid him to say that.
He heard your voice.
Poor guy. He already gets enough of me. All right. So let me just give you another example of this in the real world. And I'm sharing the classic Pinto example. There's lots of other examples I could share, but I love this one because I owned a Ford Pinto growing up. This is my Ford. After I rolled it down a hill and my cousin who lived on a farm cut the top off. It's probably the first convertible Ford Pinto you've ever seen, but that's me in the driver's seat. That's my dad proudly admiring my work, cutting the top off of the car. The Ford Pinto is a fun case for behavioral ethics because we actually have a case where we caught people in their behavioral unethical decision making. And some of you who are my age or a little bit older know this story all too well. But it became clear after the Ford Pinto failed every crash test involving crashes from behind that the Ford Pinto was not safe to be on the road. I don't know if it has anything to do with why my uncle gave me this car for free or not. I try not to think about that. But the bottom line is, if you had a rear end collision with a Ford Pinto, there was this ridiculously high likelihood of what's pictured in the bottom right corner of just kaboom. The gas tank was overly exposed and an explosion was likely to occur. What's fascinating about this case is, like in some other instances, like with Volkswagen recently with emissions test, this was factored in to the decision-making of Ford's processing. And this is how it went. And we actually have a memo that basically says what this slide simplifies. They said, well, we're going to sell about 11 million of these incredibly beautiful cars. And at a total cost per unit to modify the fuel tank, it would cost us $11 to fix this fuel tank per vehicle. And a recall then would have cost $121 million for Ford. So they did this math. And then they said, well, let's keep our math going. If we only have 2,100 accidents, that might result in 180 burn deaths, 180 seriously burned victims, and 2,100 burned out vehicles. The unit cost per accident, assuming an out-of-court settlement, came to a probable 200,000 per death, 67,000 per serious injury, and 700 per burned out vehicle. And that's a grand total of $49.53 million. So this memo leaks with all this math on it. And the conclusion of this memo was allowing the accidents to occur represented a net saving of, shoot, 70 million bucks. Therefore, a human life was mathematically proven to be worth less than $11 apart. And so the memo, never intended to go public, certainly follows suit. They produce the car as planned and the accidents start to happen as expected. And then the memo leaks. And this is a classic behavioral ethics case of a few things. Certainly we have ethical fading here, right? You can see this memo. This is not an ethicist being brought in to decide what is the best greater good. This is not Immanuel Kant talking this through. This becomes at some point a mathematical formula and a pragmatic cost-benefit analysis. Even more important, it becomes situationally, we have this money in hand that we know exactly what $70 million in our bank account would look like. We don't know any of these faces of these people who might go through these injuries or deaths. And so there's a real ethical fading, not just of it's a dilemma, but I don't even see these people who we might be harming down the road. And that makes all of this memo much easier to write and to follow. This is not the only example of this, by the way. One of the whistleblowers on a securities fraud that happened out in the Midwest a couple years ago, the whistleblower finally blew the whistle when there was a finance company that was essentially making it so people's 401ks were at great risk of being minimized or reduced to nothing. That's the simple version of the story. This whistleblower was part of this effort when her sister came to sign up with the company for a 401k. It was at that point that a face was put together with the numbers, and the woman turned herself in and the company in, and she got 5 years of federal prison, all because she couldn't stand the thought of making her sister lose her 401k, knowing that that would be what she planned to live on for her retirement. And it would do great harm to do such a thing. Oftentimes we fade out where we can these kinds of thinking and decisions. All right. So why did people arrive at these decisions? It's the ethical fading I talked about. It's the incrementalism. People argued in Ford that the focus on money making or profits had been building and building over several years. When you have a culture that reduces ethics to pragmatic gains or achievement, you're stirring the pot for unethical behavior. And then finally, I talked about this, the abstract outcomes versus the tangible rewards, all led to Ford making a terribly stupid decision. All right. The last part of the individual piece I want to talk about is, what do we really care about? Again, I've mentioned this, in the controlled environment of the classroom, it's easy to feel like we care about being moral more than anything else. But sadly, that's just not been very true to human nature. And the point is, if I value things that don't align with ethics, what I value will likely win out when they conflict, unless I have a plan and I bring moral humility to what I do. All right, situational factors. I'm gonna have to go a little bit more quickly. This hour goes too fast, but let me just share a few. Situational factors, the fundamental attribution error. This is a huge issue. It's one of the most well-known social psychology constructs that we have. It's this notion that when I do good, it's because I'm a good person. When someone else does good, or excuse me, when someone else does bad, I usually will blame it on them being a bad person. Rarely do we allow situation to account for their behavior. This is a huge problem. How often do we hear a rehab counselor complain about the bad mood or the negative personality of our clients? Every time I think that thought, I try to think, what would I be doing right now if I had just lost my job, if I had just lost my apartment, if I had a car that was being repossessed in the moment that I was meeting with that counselor? How chirpy would I feel? How sunny would my counselor view me? We often minimize these situational factors and just ascribe attributes to these clients that we see. Ah, man, they're grumpy. Oh man, they're kind of hard to work with. Oh, they're frustrating and what's problematic? They're not motivated. We use all these terms. The fundamental attribution error says that we often fail to acknowledge their situation in describing these things. Actor-observer bias is a similar concept where we would suggest that when we act poorly, it's because of the situation. We don't take blame for it, allowing our good-natured behavior to stay intact. A good mood has been tied to more ethical behavior. A bad mood, much less ethical. Even federal judges who are rated for their mood give harsher sentences when they're in a bad mood than when in a good mood. Nothing connected to the case. Time pressure is a terrible thing for ethics. If you're under a time pressure, know that your chances of acting unethically go up exponentially. You need to think about that anytime you might feel you've got a deadline because of your organization or because of merit pay raises that you're worried about, or anything else that might cause you to feel like you need to make a decision quickly. Quick decisions are often, much more often, unethical decisions. And we've seen that play out over and over again. The level of transparency and whether we'll be caught or not, sadly, has a huge influence on what we do. Stress and fatigue, if I'm stressed or if I'm fatigued. If I had a rough night's sleep, I'm much more likely to be unethical the next day. We've seen this in nurses, we've seen this in business, and I'm sure it would prove true for counselors. And then finally, we have a confirmation that being hangry is real, but it also supports unethical behavior. All right. My last category here is environmental forces. So some of you in this room, I know, represent your organization, or at least oversee some people in your organization. So I'm talking to you even more. But those of you who are not necessarily over an organization still could be an influence for good going up your organization, because we know several things about the power of organizations on ethical behavior. Creating an environment where it's unsafe to speak up, either because it's futile, you just think nothing will change, or even worse, you think it might get you retribution, is an environment that breeds unethical behavior. These are the places always where we hear the things making the paper in the grandest scale. Enron and many other institutions are just built to prevent the kind of whistleblowing or even just the acknowledgement that what we're doing isn't right to come to the surface in time to reduce harm. Excessive pressure to hit unrealistic performance targets can be a major influence on unethical behavior. It's an interesting thought. I know on one side, organizations are always looking to become better, to achieve more, and so we set these lofty goals. But be careful. A lofty goal that's excessive is very consistent in producing unethical behavior. And we see examples of this time and time again. And I wonder about how the status 26 chase could sometimes influence our own excessive feelings of pressure to do better. When I was a rehab counselor, our agency just had a rule that your merit increase was based on whether you performed better than the previous year. That's by nature excessive, because if you work your tail off one year, and then the only thing you get told after you get a raise is you better do better next year, you are actually being told, in my opinion, at some point you're going to have to game the system to keep doing better when you absolutely hit a ceiling in being more effective. So let's be careful with organizations. Conflicting goals that create perceptions of unfairness. Anytime the participant feels like there's a game being played or something's unfair, they're much more likely to be unfair themselves, AKA act unethically. When a positive example isn't being set, particularly by people within the group, we're much more likely to be unethical. So your boss acting unethically, your boss taking maybe some of the the rewards points that you're supposed to use to go to a conference and you're putting them aside for your own travel when you know your organization is not supposed to do that, that's going to trickle down. Unethical behavior, we know, trickles down. And then rewarding activities that unintentionally encourage unethical behavior can be highly problematic. You know, I don't have much time, but Wells Fargo is worth looking up. Wells Fargo was found to have opened up what we know to be now more than 3.5 million accounts for customers who did not know they were getting a new account, just because they're trying to meet excessive pressure to hit unrealistic performance goals. 3.5 million accounts were opened by over 500,000 Wells Fargo employees who were fired. Sadly, the newspaper often shared the story as Wells Fargo is full of unethical employees. That just made me laugh, even though it was just such a terribly false and misleading statement. Wells Fargo instead should have had a headline of Wells Fargo does everything they can to induce unethical behavior in otherwise good employees. I don't stand any, there's no reason to believe based on any literature we have that Wells Fargo happened to have 500,000 more unethical employees than other banks who are competing in the same space at the same time. No, organizational pressures cause people to act less than themselves. I won't go so far as ever to say that those Wells Fargo employees have no blame, but the blame shared with the powerful environmental forces that produced unethical behavior in large part. All right, I'm going to finish some of this story with a little instruction on how you can be unethical without feeling terrible about yourself. First of all, if we're just going to take all that we've learned, you'll want to take small steps. Rome wasn't conquered in a day. One thing you'll hope for if you're trying to be unethical is you'll never really know when you cross the line from a bad choice to an unethical choice to an illegal choice. And that's where everyone in the Wall Street Journal found themselves. You'll find it if you want to go look it up. People constantly saying, I never really noticed I crossed the line. That's incrementalism, or the slippery slope at its finest. Forget misdeeds. Research has shown that people are more likely to forget their own unethical acts than other events. So thankfully, our human mind is already set up to help us be unethical. Rationalization and justification are your friend. If you don't like the real story, change it until you do. Make important decisions when tired and turn off the lights. Pretend that honesty and competence are related. This gets a lot of people through by saying, I obviously am succeeding. That means I'm good. And I have a privilege or a right to break some of the rules when I need to. And if you hang out with immoral peers and derogate the goody two shoes, you're much more likely to find yourselves in unethical territory without feeling bad about it. Now, I've got a few minutes left. What if you actually want to be good when it's tempting not to? There are some great options out there. First of all, it begins with ethical humility. You're sick of me saying that, I know. In other words, we need to recognize that we're capable of doing unethical things even when they're clearly unethical. I have never seen anyone lose their counseling license after they talked through an issue with one of their colleagues because they weren't sure what to do in the gray area. If you find yourself there, pat yourself on the back and know that there's absolutely no way this could go off the rails entirely. When does it go off the rails? It goes off the rails when you don't want to talk with a colleague. It goes off the rails when you'd rather do these decisions when no one's watching. So plan ahead. One of the main keys is to plan, like I said earlier, not just on how you want to act, but what might get in the way. Let me give a simple, lighthearted example that just happens to me every year in March. In March, I say to myself, Brian, I really want to keep being an honest employee who shows integrity in my work. It's something I value. It's a silly thing to say, but I do say that to myself. And I actually don't feel good about myself when I have a day where I really don't do well here. And I have those days. What's my potential gumption trap, as they say in Zen of the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance? March Madness. If you're not familiar, the basketball tournament that takes over the college world and fills my computer screen more and more with alternatives to working in the daytime, which isn't a typical sports issue. Usually sports are at night. So what can I do? Well, sadly, I think a lot of us stop short of saying, you know what? I want to be honest, therefore I will. I'm just going to go to work. I'm sure it'll work out. That is going to produce a March Madness binge. Where suddenly you wake up from your days 4 hours later saying, oh my goodness, I didn't get hardly anything I promised my employer I was going to get done today. So what could I do? In this simple, lighthearted example, First thing I do is I don't sign up for any easy access to games from my work computer. People are often shocked, since I'm a sport fan, that I don't sign up for some of these channels. And I tell them the reason why is because I want to be a good boy. I could choose select teams or games that I want to check in on. If that elephant is just aching to get something, I can schedule that elephant. Putting the elephant on a schedule means that I still get to have some control while allowing some release of my human nature to need to see some of that last minute game with the team that I really care about most. So I usually pick 2 or 3 teams that I'll allow myself to follow to some extent. Give myself permission to watch the last 3 to 5 minutes of a close game that I pre-selected. Ask a spouse or partner who would support me being honest in my employment to ask me how he did on challenging days. In the best of days, in those first 13 time when all 64 teams are playing, it doesn't hurt for her to just say, how did it go? Me knowing that she's going to ask that question makes me do a little bit more good than bad. And then finally, if it was more serious, I don't do this with March Madness, but I can even journal or track the amount of work time spent watching, so I could be honest and not rewrite the history later to say I actually was a good boy and this is why. All right, so I won't have time for these exercises, but you have these slides. One of the things you can do is just walk yourself through that 3-step process. Think of 1 or 2 common temptations you face at work. You would know those, I won't. Rehab counselors, take a moment to think about what you might be feeling that could make a decision difficult. Sorry, I have a typo there. I'll fix that and send it out again. That's number 2 is just a mistake. Write at least 1 down for each potential dilemma. And then what can you do to counter unhelpful feelings in order to maintain ethical behavior? Just that simple process, we know, drastically improves good people doing good instead of good people doing bad. It's been shown over and over in research. And if we bring enough ethical humility to say, I might need that, you could do it too. Who's not going to do this? If you see this exercise and you say, I'm not the type of person who needs that, well, you're the person I'm wishing I could talk to. You're the person I'm wishing behavioral ethics could reach. So forgive me if I make you feel bad, but if any of you in this room say, I would never need an exercise like this, I would say you're 100% wrong. I'm not saying you're wrong 100% of the time. I'm saying it's beyond human to pretend that you don't need something like this sometimes, because you are not a 100% rational being any more than I am. And so I'm trying to convey as much of moral humility myself to say, I don't always get here, but I hope you would do the same. All right, last couple slides. 3 rules of thumb that the US Academy at West Point uses. And actually all their cadets memorize these 3 points. Does this action attempt to deceive or allow anyone to be deceived? Does this action gain or allow to gain a privilege or advantage which I or someone else could not otherwise be entitled to? And 3, would I be satisfied by the outcome if I were on the receiving end of the action I'm about to take? I have more tips here. One that I would really like to focus in on is create or post a personal oath or an inspiring quote or even a company mission statement somewhere you can see it. When we're reminded of what we're trying to be, we actually tend to do it much more frequently. So when I teach an ethics class now, the end product is that all of my students have to create an oath as a counselor, or a counselor's oath of what they will always adhere to be their best selves, to live up to what they expect of themselves, and where they'll never cross a line. Why do I do this? The research shows that people who create an oath, and even more so the people who post the oath somewhere in their office space, are much more likely to act ethically on a day-to-day basis in the choices that aren't gray, but are clear. All right, so in summary, the biggest take home I hope everyone feels a bit more strongly than before is ethics is more than knowledge of a code. It's more than just being a good person, which all of you are. And it's often not fully irrational. And it's that irrational space that if we acknowledge a little bit more, plan for a little bit more, and we'll give more attention to humbly on a consistent basis, that makes us become what we think we are, which is people who consistently act on what we know and do what we believe in.